Good afternoon, and welcome to Salem Academy and College. Salem Academy and College was founded almost 250 years ago by the Moravians. This institution, this venue, is the perfect intersection of women and time. And I want to take you on a journey back in time, when the Moravians founded this community and institution. And before we do, I want you to cast your mind back and think about what was it like to be a woman in those days. You may have been in a field. Certainly you weren't in this air-conditioned venue, for sure. You might have been in a field. You may have been in a log cabin, sitting on a hard bench. You had a dress dragging around your ankles. You probably had a cap on your head, right? It was a tough time, certainly not cushy as it is today. So I want to take you on this journey, and I'm uniquely qualified to take you on this journey because it's a journey about enterprising, entrepreneurial women, an organization of women in business well ahead of their time. The Moravians believed that it's a beautiful faith of tolerance and acceptance, and they believe that all people are created equal in the eyes of God. And at that time, they believed in educating women. They believed in educating minorities. This was a radical thought at that time. So as a woman in business, I feel that this story needs to be told. And my inspiration was about a year. For the past 6 years, I have been the director of the Center for Women in Business here at Salem College. And about a year and a half ago, I was over in the museum here at the school, which takes you through the history of our school. And in the center of the museum, there's a beautiful timeline that's painted on the walls, all four walls around the room, the central room. And I started out at the beginning of the timeline. It was 1766 and the founding of the Salem community, and later, a little bit later, the founding of the school. And as I read around the room, around the timeline, I was really in awe of the women that had gone through this institution, the courageous and talented women that had gone before me. And I got to the end of the timeline, and there it was, 2006, and the founding of the Center for Women in Business. I was shocked. I was like, wow, I've been here for 4 years and I had no idea. I ran to the beginning of the timeline and I said to myself, this is a story that has to be told. The community of Salem, the school was founded, it was a product of enterprising, entrepreneurial women in business. So I thought, wow, I've got to tell this story. But when I do, I've got to understand, why were these women so successful? Why were they so successful well ahead of their time? So after I looked at this timeline and I started thinking about how am I going to tell this story, and I did a little bit of research. A lot of research has already been done. Certainly on that timeline was a lot of research. But I went back and thought, the community of Salem and the school was founded well before we were even a country. Not well before, but a short while before we were a country. And despite the urging from the wives of our founding fathers, who encouraged their husbands to don't forget about the women, our Constitution was written as all men are created equal, right? And it wasn't until the signing of the 19th Amendment in the 20th century that we even had rights. So why were these women so successful, so well ahead of their time? Now, as I said, the Moravians believed in educating women, this radical thought well before, at that time. And if you were, to tell you a little bit about women at that time, if you were not a wealthy white woman, your time on this planet was short. You weren't educated most likely. You married well before the age of 18. In these parts, you probably married a farmer. You had 8 to 10 children, and you died before the age of 40. If you were an African American woman or a Native American woman, your time on this planet was far more bleak. But if you were a Moravian woman, you most likely were educated or at least schooled. You had a place in the community. You were secure. You could even hold leadership roles in the community. So think about that. So let's go back on our journey. Back almost 250 years ago, 16 young Moravian and girls walked. They walked almost 500 miles from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, all the way to the Piedmont of North Carolina to help settle this community of faith. So life was rugged back then. And their first priority, this group of women, their first priority was to sustain themselves, protect themselves, and create a livelihood and help the community grow. They wanted a home of their own. At that time, the Moravian community, they were organized as choirs. Young women and girls lived together, worked together. They were known as the Single Sisters. Young men and boys up generally through the age of 18, they lived and worked together as well, and they were known as the Single Brothers. So the Single Sisters, they wanted a place of their own to live. They lived within the church among other families. But in order to have their own place to live, they had to raise resources so they could build their own building. And the community leaders at that time thought, yeah, right? They totally underestimated the tenacity and stamina of these women. So they got busy and they started raising resources to build their own home through entrepreneurial efforts. They took out loans and sought gifts from other Moravian communities, both in Bethlehem and even in Europe. They bartered for resources, but they also sold goods and services. Some of the services that they sold for wages included cooking, cleaning, gardening, sewing. And the goods that they made and sold included leather goods like leather gloves. It included woven linens, fine needlepoint for fine cloths, and the list goes on. So they actually raised a profit through this. But they also, many of them were teachers. And it wasn't long before word got out in the surrounding communities that you could send your daughters to Salem to be educated. Right? So the Single Sisters created a boarding school, and they started it with 3 young local girls. And they charged for teaching, for educating them, and they charged for boarding them. And they made a profit, not just through the school, but through their entrepreneurial efforts. So as the school grew and their community grew, they started gathering the resources to build their own home and school. And just when they had gathered all their resources, the tavern, which was the center of the community at that time, burned down. And the Single Sisters allocated their resources so that the tavern could be rebuilt and the community could thrive. And they had to go back to the drawing board to regather their resources. And in 1785, they laid the cornerstone of what would become their new home, and a little over a year later, 32 young Moravian women and girls and their boarding students moved into what is today known as the Single Sisters House. It has been renovated. It was renovated in 2006, and it is the oldest educational building on any campus in North Carolina. And it's certainly the oldest and the most significant building in women's education in America today. It has been, like I said, it's been renovated. The museum is there. If you get a chance while you're here at Salem, go see the museum and the house, and you will not be disappointed. It is certainly an attestament to the importance of equal opportunity and equal education for women. So back to their profits, because they were businesswomen and they earned a good deal of profits late through the 18th century and well into the 19th century. And what did they do with those profits? They first paid off what they owed. By 1820, they had paid off all their original loans. They gave resources or money to the community to build roads, to build waterworks. The cistern that is still in the Salem Square today was built with the profits of the Single Sisters. They also paid off the debts of the single brothers. And they are credited for giving money to the state of North Carolina to build what today is known as UNC Chapel Hill. And like any good businesswoman, they were philanthropic with their profits. They are credited for keeping a fund for the poor. They sent monies to victims of a major fire in Fayetteville, North Carolina. They sent resources and money to Antigua, to victims of a hurricane. And the list goes on and on. So why were these women 250 years ago so successful? Now, a disclaimer before I go through three major themes that I hypothesized that were the pillars of their success. It wasn't that things were so rosy and that women could do whatever they wanted to back then, because they certainly can't today, right? But we can do a lot more. But they lived in, it was still a very hierarchical structure, and it certainly was male-dominated. But all women in America lived in a male-dominated society. So that's my point. Something set them apart. What was it that made them so successful ahead of their time? So my three themes, and I'll go through them one by one. First, to summarize them, that they had great need among tremendous resources, available resources. Two is single-sex environments and the benefits that accrue to that. And third, certainly, is the Moravian faith. So let's talk about need and necessities among great resources. It was hard back then. They walked to North Carolina. North Carolina was abundant with resources, moderate climates, fertile soil, all of those, that created great resources and raw materials for their entrepreneurial ventures. But all women in this area had that same benefit, right? So that's not what set them apart. Second, single-sex environments. Study after study after study has been done to show that women, especially in single-sex environments, have greater self-confidence, have more positive self-esteem, and both of these are qualities that are critical for success in college, in careers, and certainly in life. Then these women, they were among women day in and day out, very rarely, a couple times a week, with special events, and certainly on Sunday, they were able to be around the single brothers, but for the most part, they were just around themselves. So certainly those benefits of that single-sex environment accrued to them. But there's another thing that I think that they were void of. It's something I call negative encouragement. Women are great at encouraging each other, especially when they share common goals. Men encourage women, but they encourage women to do what they think as men that women ought to do and what they think they should do, right? And I'll give you a personal story very briefly to drive this point, to to make it come to life. I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up in a great family, a traditional family. I had a great childhood. I rode horses all my life. I was a tough kid. I wanted to be a veterinarian, an equine veterinarian, more than anything in the world. So I went off to NC State. I made good grades. I worked hard. I took my VCATs. I was getting ready to apply to veterinarian school. And somebody very influential in my family came to visit me in Raleigh my senior year. And he took me to lunch and he sat me down and he said, "You really shouldn't be a veterinarian." First, women aren't physically cut out to be veterinarians, especially large animal veterinarians. And second, it's not proper for a woman to be a veterinarian. A 360-degree change in my career plans. Here, at that time, that would have been 220 years later that these Moravian women founded this place. 220 years later, and men, it was still, women weren't heard. So anyway, certainly these single sisters did not have men day in and day out telling them what they should do and what they should not or could not do. They were void of negative encouragement. Third and last, certainly the Moravian faith. It is a beautiful faith, a faith of deep tolerance and acceptance, a faith that all are created equal in the eyes of God. And if you've seen a Moravian cemetery, you've seen that all the stones are of same equal size, shape, and color. And that is because all are created equal both in life and in death. So this Moravian faith, this great faith that encouraged the education of women, the acceptance of women, and valued women, certainly was a pillar of their success as entrepreneurial, enterprising women, as an organization of women in business well ahead of their time. And with that, I'll leave you with the Moravian motto. And it's a motto that I've come to love and I use to guide my time these days. In necessities, unity. In non-necessities, liberty. In all things, love. Thank you.